Hello and welcome to ZappySys ODBC PowerPack 101. Today you will learn how to load REST API data into SQL Server using ZappySys Data Gateway and ZappySys ODBC drivers. Before starting the presentation, let me briefly tell what ZappySys Data Gateway is. It's a tiny SQL server which gets installed as Windows service as a part of ZappySys ODBC PowerPack. Basically, you can view it as a bridge between your client application and a data source you want to access. In our case, the client application is a SQL server and the data source is a REST API service. Actually, with ZappySys Data Gateway, you can also load SOAP API data, XML, CSV files, ODBC sources, or other ZappySys ODBC driver based sources. At the end of the video, I will go through other use cases of when to use ZappySys Data Gateway and tell more about it. Okay, so we can start. So suppose you have this REST API service and it returns customers in JSON format, many customers, and it returns it as JSON array under property value, and you want to load all these customers into your SQL server. And it's almost like you want to write a query like this. Select customers into customers table from this REST API. And actually, ZappySys Data Gateway provides you with that kind of functionality. The thing you will need to do is just create a linked server to the gateway and write a similar query like this and load the customers into the table. So to start, first thing you should do is open ZappySys Data Gateway Configuration Manager, which is found in Windows Start menu in ZappySys folder. And once you do that, create a user. It's very similar to SQL Server logins and users, so we will just create one, make it an administrator, and after that you are ready to create a data source. So click add and give it a name. I will name it OData. And in the connector type, there are several options you can use. So use ODBC generic if you have a data source created in ODBC Data Source Administrator. Just make sure that the data source is created under System DSN tab and that you run 64-bit version of ODBC Data Source Administrator, because otherwise the gateway won't be able to access the data source. And then you can use native ZappySys ODBC drivers, so it will just create data source right in the gateway. And I should mention that it is twice fast as ODBC data source based on ZappySys ODBC drivers. So if you have one, I suggest switching to native. So now I'm selecting ZappySys JSON driver since our data is in JSON. This box tells me I have to configure the settings. And now I will just have to paste the link here, go to preview to make sure I get the data. Click OK, I got the data. The problem here is that all customers are in one row, in one cell. So I will just replace this $sign with the column name where the customers are located. And you can to make things easier and quicker, you can also use this list to select data from the populated tables. Okay, I'm doing preview again. And okay, so I get the customers as I want, one customer per row. Okay, I'm clicking OK. Then I have to edit the users. I add the admin, give it full permissions, clicking OK. And now I have to go to General tab and make note on what port the gateway is running, and make sure SQL Server compatibility checkbox is checked too. Okay, so once I do that, I can just save the data source and restart the gateway, and then go back to SSMS and add a linked server. Okay, I will give it a name, gateway. In the provider, select SQL Server Native Client version 11. In the data source, enter the address where your gateway is running, localhost in my case. Then put a comma and then enter the port number on which it runs. In the catalog field, enter the data source name, and in our case it's OData. Then don't forget to go to Security tab and configure the user. It's the same user we created and assigned to the data source. Clicking OK, created the linked server, and now it's time to execute the query. Okay, but before executing the query, let's modify it a bit. Gateway, and I will use the same query we used in the preview. Okay, 20 customers loaded. Checking on that, and voila, as you see, customers are loaded into the SQL Server. So that's how easy to load REST API data into SQL Server using ZappySys Data Gateway. In the next part, I will show you how to get data from products, not from customers, and how to reuse the same data source, but just override the URL. We start from where we left. So you were using this query and getting customers very happily, and then you discovered that you need to get products as well. So the service stays the same, just the table name of the OData changes, meaning the URL changes. And you don't need to create another data source just for products. We can reuse the data source for customers and just override the URL. And to do that, just go to the gateway. Again, configure the data source. We will be overriding this property. And yeah, to do that, open Query Builder. And you can override many properties here. We will override URL. You can override, let's say, HTTP request method, and basically all properties you saw in the Properties tab. I'm clicking OK, replacing $sign with value to get one product per row. OK, we got the products. And to make things easier, we can go to code generator and copy the T-SQL query it has generated for us. So I'm copying the query, clicking OK, going back to SSMS, pasting the query. We need to use our gateway, and let's execute the query. And you see, instead of customers, we retrieved products. So you see how it's easy to override a URL for the same data source and reuse it. But it's not always possible to override a property, and sometimes you have to create another data source. So if that's the case, you have to know that for that data source you will need to create another linked server. So one linked server for one data source. In the next part, I will show you how to parameterize a query inside a stored procedure. So we start from where we left again, and you are querying products and customers from REST API successfully, and then you notice that throughout all your database you have these queries repeating themselves in all over the places, and you start thinking that maybe you are about to create a stored procedure and make it parametric, so you have a variable there, and you can define and set what data you want to retrieve, particularly products or customers. So let's do that. Let's create a stored procedure. So I'm copying this query and pasting it here in the stored procedure template I have. As you see, it has a variable, a parameter table name, which will set what URL to retrieve, but only the last part of the URL. And as you see, we will define the query, then we will execute it here. Okay, and the problem now is that we cannot insert variable here because OpenQuery doesn't allow us that. So we will have to make this whole query dynamic, not only this part. And to do that, we will need to escape single quote. So what I do, I just select the query and then I replace one single quote with two single quotes. Let's do that. Okay, and once the single quotes are escaped, I can put the query here, and now I'm ready to make this query dynamic. So namely, I can replace this part, products, with variable table name. Okay, looks good. Let's select the procedure and create it. Okay, now we are ready to query the customers. Okay, we retrieved customers. Now let's do the same for products. And we also got the products. So this concludes the demo of how to load REST API data into a SQL server, override a URL, and execute dynamic queries. In the next part, I'm going to cover other use cases and talk about ZappySys Data Gateway in depth. As I talked in the introduction, you can view ZappySys Data Gateway as a bridge between your client application and a data source. It uses Microsoft TDS protocol for communication, so you can connect to it as you would connect to a Microsoft SQL server. Therefore, any SQL Server compatible driver can be used to connect to the gateway. For example, JDBC, ADO.NET, OLEDB, or ODBC driver. Your client application can be a SQL Server, as you learned today, Pentaho, Java application, or any application with any SQL Server compatible driver. Basically, ZappySys Data Gateway can feed data to your client app from ODBC data source or a data source based on a ZappySys ODBC driver. In turn, an ODBC data source would get data from the underlying source, for example, a database, Excel file, etc. And similarly, ZappySys ODBC driver would connect to a REST API, SOAP API, and XML, CSV, or other file, and then retrieve data too. Now let's move on and let me introduce you with other use cases of the gateway. You can use ZappySys Data Gateway in the following scenarios. In the first scenario, your client application doesn't support ODBC connectivity. For example, it's a SQL Server, a Java application, or a Google spreadsheet. In the second use case, you need to access ZappySys ODBC driver-based data source on a non-Windows machine. For instance, a computer with Linux, macOS, or Solaris. So you would install ZappySys ODBC PowerPack on another machine based on Windows and then connect to ZappySys Data Gateway from a non-Windows machine. In the third scenario, you want all data sources to be accessed from one place instead of configuring each ODBC data source on every client machine. In the last case, you are not allowed to install third-party ODBC drivers on the server due to a compliance reason, simply meaning system administrator doesn't allow you to install ZappySys ODBC PowerPack directly on the server you want to access data on. Therefore, you will need to install ODBC PowerPack on another machine and configure data sources using the gateway. Today you learned how to get data from REST API and load it into SQL Server using ZappySys Data Gateway and ZappySys ODBC drivers. At first, we executed a simple query and queried customers, then overrode the URL of the data source and retrieved products. Finally, we created a stored procedure with a parameter which can query any OData table by overriding the URL. Now you can easily use the concepts we went through to load data into SQL Server from almost any source, be it SOAP API, XML or CSV file, or ODBC data source. Please share your thoughts and questions in comment section. Also, don't forget to check other ODBC PowerPack videos for more use cases. Thanks for watching.